Commander Zethkar stepped off his battlecruiser onto the docking bay of Harmony Point Station. His massive 8-foot frame cast long shadows across the metal floor. His dark, chitinous skin gleamed under the bright lights like armor plating. Sharp claws clicked against the deck plates with each step. Other aliens in the docking bay quickly moved out of his way. Zethkar was used to this reaction. Fear followed him wherever he went. He was one of the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy. His name was whispered in terror across 17 star systems that his forces had conquered. The Valdorian Empire sent him here for one reason. He got results. The space station buzzed with activity. Merchants from dozens of worlds traded goods and information. Diplomats from various species conducted business in the neutral territory. Everyone knew why Zethkar was here. The humans had requested peace talks. Most species eventually did when they realized they could not win against Valdorian might. A small group approached him near the customs checkpoint. Zethkar recognized them immediately as humans. They looked exactly as he expected. Soft pink, skin with no natural armor. Short bodies that barely reached his chest. No claws or fangs or spikes. No visible weapons. They looked fragile and weak. The human in front stepped forward. He appeared to be their leader. Gray hair covered his head and face. Lines marked his skin around his eyes and mouth. He wore a simple blue uniform with small metal badges. Nothing impressive or threatening about him at all. "Commander Zethkar," the human said in a calm voice. "I am Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Force. Welcome to Harmony Point." Zethkar looked down at the small man. "Captain Morrison, I am here because your species has requested negotiations. This is wise. Many worlds have chosen the path of surrender rather than face the full might of the Valdorian Empire." Morrison nodded slightly. "These are my colleagues, Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez and Sergeant Pete Collins." The female human was even smaller than Morrison. She had dark hair tied back and wore the same blue uniform. Her skin was darker than Morrison's. She looked young and untested. The male sergeant was bigger than the other two, but still tiny compared to Zethkar. He had short brown hair and serious eyes. "Your reputations precede you," Morrison said politely. "We have heard of your victories across the Outer Rim territories." Zethkar's chest swelled with pride. Of course they had heard. Everyone knew of his conquests. The crystal cities of Nexus Prime fell in 3 days. The floating fortresses of Kepler 442b lasted only a week. Your intelligence networks are adequate if they have informed you of these achievements. "Impressive," Rodriguez said, though her tone seemed neutral rather than awed. Collins remained silent, studying Zethkar with curious eyes rather than fearful ones. This puzzled the Valdorian commander. Most species showed proper respect when meeting him. These humans seemed almost casual about his presence. "The siege of the Krell homeworld was particularly satisfying," Zethkar continued, hoping to see some reaction. "Their rebellion lasted 6 months. They thought their underground cities would protect them. We simply collapsed the tunnels from orbit. Millions died in the first hour." Morrison listened without changing expression. "War is always costly." "For the losers, yes," Zethkar replied with a harsh laugh. "The Valdorian Empire loses very few soldiers in our campaigns. Superior technology and tactics ensure victory with minimal casualties to our forces." "That must be efficient," Rodriguez said. Zethkar frowned. The humans were not reacting as expected. Where was the fear, the desperate pleading, the offers of tribute? Instead, they seemed to be treating this like a normal conversation between equals. "Perhaps we should move to more comfortable surroundings," Morrison suggested. "The diplomatic quarters have been prepared for our discussions, but first, would you like to see some of the station? We could visit the observation deck or the recreation areas." "I did not come here for tourism," Zethkar growled. "I came to accept your surrender and discuss terms." Morrison's eyebrows raised slightly. "Surrender? I think there may be some misunderstanding, Commander. We are here to discuss potential cooperation between our species, perhaps even mutual defense agreements." Zethkar stared at the small human. Cooperation? Your species wishes to cooperate with the Valdorian Empire as equals. That was our hope, yes. The alien warrior threw back his head and laughed. The sound echoed through the docking bay like thunder. Several nearby aliens stopped their activities to stare. Equals? You jest, Captain Morrison. Look at yourself. Look at your companions. You are soft creatures with no natural weapons, no armor, no claws or fangs. You could not survive 1 minute in hand-to-hand combat with a Valdorian child. Collins spoke for the first time. Physical strength isn't everything, Commander. Is it not? Zethkar leaned down until his face was close to the sergeant's. Then what else matters in warfare? Pretty words? Good intentions? The universe respects only power. The strong rule. The weak serve or die. There are different kinds of strength, Morrison said quietly. Zethkar straightened up and crossed his arms. Name one kind of strength that matters more than the ability to destroy your enemies. The three humans exchanged glances. Rodriguez seemed to be holding back a smile. Collins shifted his weight slightly. Morrison simply nodded. We would be happy to discuss that topic, Commander, Morrison said, but perhaps in more private surroundings. The station's recreation deck has an excellent view of the Andromeda Edge Nebula. We could continue our conversation there. Fine, Zethkar agreed. But understand this, humans. I have conquered more worlds than you have visited. I have led armies that could devastate your entire homeworld. I have seen species far more impressive than yours kneel before Valdorian might. Whatever stories you think you have to tell, I doubt they will compare to genuine military achievement. Morrison began walking toward the lift that would take them to the upper levels of the station. We shall see, Commander. We shall see. As they moved through the corridors of Harmony Point, Zethkar noticed other aliens watching them. Some whispered to each other as the group passed. A few pointed at the humans with what looked like respect. This confused him even more. Why would other species show respect to such obviously weak creatures? The recreation deck was impressive. Large windows provided a clear view of space. The Andromeda Edge Nebula swirled in brilliant colors of purple and gold. Stars dotted the darkness like tiny diamonds. Several comfortable seating areas were arranged around the viewing area. They settled into chairs that had been sized for different species. Zethkar's chair was much larger than the human furniture. He looked out at the nebula and then back at his companions. This is beautiful, Rodriguez said, gazing at the view. Beauty is a luxury for those strong enough to survive, Zethkar replied. The weak do not live long enough to appreciate such things. Morrison leaned back in his chair. You mentioned the Krell Rebellion, Commander. How long did that conflict last overall? From start to finish? 2 years. But most of that time was spent hunting down scattered resistance groups. The main fighting was over quickly once we committed our full forces. 2 years is a significant commitment, Collins observed. Zethkar waved a clawed hand dismissively. Nothing compared to some campaigns. The longest war in Valdorian history lasted 20 years. We fought the insectoid hive worlds across 4 star systems, but we won in the end, as we always do. 20 years, Morrison repeated thoughtfully. That is indeed a long time to maintain a military campaign. What is the longest your species has ever fought a single war? Zethkar asked, confident that no human conflict could match Valdorian achievements. Morrison was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars. Rodriguez and Collins waited for his response. Finally, the captain turned back to face the alien commander. That depends on how you count, Commander, but we once fought a war that lasted over 100 years. Zethkar blinked in surprise. Impossible. No species could maintain warfare for such a period. The 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337 to 1453. Though there were periods of peace mixed in, the conflict spanned more than a century. Primitive. Tribal conflicts do not count as real warfare, Zethkar scoffed, though he was secretly impressed by the time frame. Morrison smiled slightly. Perhaps you would prefer more recent examples then. Zethkar leaned forward in his chair. the swirling colors of the nebula reflected in his dark eyes. More recent examples? Very well, Captain Morrison. Tell me of these human wars. But I warn you, I have heard many species boast of their military prowess. Few impress me. Morrison stood and walked to the large window. He placed his hands behind his back and stared out at the stars. June 6, 1944. We called it D-Day, the largest seaborne invasion in our history. Seaborne? Zethkar's voice carried a note of confusion. You mean water? Your species fought battles on water? Over water, Collins corrected. We crossed the English Channel to invade Nazi-occupied France. The distance was only about 20 miles, but it might as well have been 20 light years. Rodriguez joined Morrison at the window. 150,000 soldiers crossed that water in one day. They knew thousands of them would die on the beaches. They went anyway. Zethkar frowned. Why not use orbital bombardment? Destroy the enemy positions from space and then land safely? We didn't have spaceflight then, Morrison said simply. No energy weapons, no force fields, no medical nanites to heal wounds instantly. Just men in metal boats crossing rough water. Metal boats? Zethkar stood up, his full height casting a shadow across the seating area. You mean primitive water vessels, not proper assault craft? Landing craft, Collins nodded. Many of them were built quickly in factories. Some leaked, some broke, down before reaching the shore. The men inside got seasick from the rough waves. They were scared and cold and wet before the fighting even started. Morrison turned back to face the alien commander. The German forces had months to prepare their defenses. Concrete bunkers with machine guns overlooking the beaches, artillery positions on the cliffs, mines buried in the sand, barbed wire everywhere. And your forces attacked anyway? Zethkar asked. Without proper reconnaissance, without overwhelming firepower? We had some air support, Rodriguez said. Propeller-driven aircraft. But the weather was bad that morning. Cloud cover limited visibility. Many bombs missed their targets. Zethkar began pacing across the recreation deck. His claws clicked against the metal floor with each step. This makes no military sense. Why not wait for better conditions, better weapons? Why sacrifice soldiers unnecessarily? Morrison watched, the alien warrior pace. Because waiting meant more people would die under Nazi occupation. Every day we delayed meant more executions, more concentration camps, more suffering. Sometimes you have to act even when the odds are against you. The first wave hit Omaha Beach at 6:30 in the morning, Collins continued. The landing craft dropped their ramps 50 yards from shore. Men jumped into water up to their necks. They had to wade through surf while machine guns fired at them from the cliffs. Many drowned before reaching land, Rodriguez added quietly. The heavy packs and equipment pulled them under. Others were hit by gunfire while still in the water, but they kept coming. Wave after wave of boats. Zethkar stopped pacing. How many casualties did you suffer in this first assault? Omaha Beach alone. About 2,400 dead and wounded on the first day, Morrison replied. Utah Beach was lighter, maybe 200, but across all 5 landing zones we lost thousands. The alien commander stared at Morrison. You lost thousands of soldiers in a single day? For one battle? For one day of one battle, Collins corrected. The fighting continued. For weeks after that, house to house through French towns, hedgerow to hedgerow across the countryside. Morrison returned to his chair. But that wasn't the worst of it, Commander. Want to know what really impressed me about D-Day? Zethkar remained standing, his dark eyes fixed on the human captain. Tell me. The paratroopers, Morrison said. 13,000 men jumped out of aircraft in the middle of the night. Hours before the beach landings, they jumped into enemy territory with minimal equipment and no backup plan. Rodriguez nodded. Many of the aircraft were hit by anti-aircraft fire. Some paratroopers jumped from burning planes. Others landed miles from their intended targets, scattered across the French countryside. Alone or in small groups, Collins added, cut off from their units. No communication with headquarters, no heavy weapons, just whatever they could carry. Morrison leaned forward. A private named Joe Martinez landed in a swamp 3 miles from his drop zone. His parachute got tangled in a tree. He hung there for 2 hours, afraid to make noise because German patrols were searching for stragglers. When he finally cut himself free, he was alone, Rodriguez continued. No radio contact, no map reference points he could recognize. Just his rifle and about 50 rounds of ammunition. Zethkar found himself sitting back down without realizing it. What did this Martinez do? He walked toward the sound of gunfire, Morrison said simply. Found a small group of other lost paratroopers. Together they attacked a German communications post that was coordinating defensive fire against the beach landings. Collins smiled slightly. 6 men with rifles took out a fortified position that was directing artillery strikes against thousands of their fellow soldiers on the beaches. 6 men? Zethkar's voice was barely above a whisper. They knew they probably wouldn't survive, Morrison explained. But they also knew that Radio Post was helping kill their friends on the beaches, so they attacked it anyway. Rodriguez walked over to a small table and picked up a datapad. Want to hear about the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc? Zethkar nodded, slowly, not trusting his voice. 25 men and 10 landing craft, she began. Their target was a 100-foot cliff defended by German positions. Intel said there were 6 heavy artillery guns up there that could hit both Omaha and Utah beaches. How did they plan to scale a 100-foot cliff under enemy fire? Zethkar asked. Collins chuckled grimly. Ropes and ladders. Some had grappling, hooks shot from mortars. Others used extension ladders borrowed from London fire departments. Fire department ladders? Zethkar repeated in disbelief. The men climbed straight up the cliff face while Germans shot at them from above, Morrison continued. Some Germans cut the ropes, others threw grenades down at the climbers. Rodriguez looked at her datapad. By the time the Rangers reached the top of the cliff, they had taken 50% casualties. Half their force was dead or wounded. And when they got to the top, Zethkar found himself asking. The artillery guns weren't there, Collins said, flatly. The Germans had moved them inland the week before. The Rangers had climbed that cliff and lost half their men for nothing. Zethkar felt something strange in his chest. A tightness he had never experienced before. For nothing? Morrison shook his head. Not for nothing. They didn't know the guns had been moved. They climbed that cliff because their friends on the beaches were counting on them. Because the mission required it. Because someone had to do it. The survivors held their position. For 2 days, Rodriguez added. Cut off from reinforcements, low on ammunition. They fought off repeated German counterattacks until relief forces could reach them. Zethkar stared out at the nebula again. The swirling colors seemed less beautiful now, more like smoke from a battlefield. Your soldiers climbed a cliff under fire to destroy weapons that were not even there. They climbed the cliff to destroy weapons they believed were there. Morrison corrected gently. They acted on the best information available. They took massive risks to protect soldiers they had never met. I do not understand, Zethkar said slowly. In Valdorian warfare, we use superior technology to minimize our own casualties. We strike from positions of overwhelming strength. We do not send soldiers into situations where death is almost certain. Collins leaned back in his chair. Sometimes certain death is the only option available. Sometimes the mission is more important than the individual. But why? Zethkar's voice carried genuine confusion. Why would soldiers accept such missions? Were they forced to fight? Morrison smiled sadly. Most of them volunteered, Commander. They signed up knowing they might be sent into situations exactly like D-Day. Volunteers. Zethkar's voice cracked slightly. Rodriguez nodded. Free citizens who chose military service. They could have stayed home, worked in factories, lived safe lives. Instead, they chose to fight. For what? Zethkar demanded. What could possibly motivate such behavior? Morrison stood again and walked to the window. For the idea that people should be free to choose their own government. For the belief that genocide is wrong. For their friends and families back home. For each other, Collins added quietly. Zethkar sat in silence for several minutes. The three humans waited patiently, watching the alien commander process what he had heard. Finally, he spoke again. How many of your species died in this D-Day operation? In the first 24 hours? About 4,400, Morrison replied. By the end of the Normandy campaign, we had lost over 200,000 soldiers. 200,000, Zethkar repeated numbly. But we freed France, Rodriguez said. We stopped the Holocaust. We ended a war that had killed millions of innocent people. Morrison turned from the window. Commander, you asked what kind of strength matters. More than the ability to destroy enemies. I think you just heard an example. Zethkar looked up at the human captain. For the first time in his adult life, he had no response ready. No boast about Valdorian superiority. No dismissive comment about primitive tactics. The next morning, Zethkar arrived at the diplomatic dining hall earlier than scheduled. He had barely slept. Images of humans climbing cliffs and wading through gunfire kept replaying in his mind. When the human delegation arrived, he noticed they looked rested and calm. Good morning, Commander, Morrison said as he took his seat. I hope you found your quarters comfortable. Zethkar nodded stiffly. Adequate. He had spent most of the night pacing his room, trying to understand what he had heard the previous day. The Valdorian military database contained no records of armies accepting such massive casualties for strategic objectives. The dining hall served food from dozens of worlds. Zethkar ate mechanically, his thoughts elsewhere. Finally, he could not contain his questions any longer. Your D-Day operation, he began. The casualties you described. How did your military command justify such losses? Rodriguez looked up from her meal. Justify to whom? To your government, to your people. In the Valdorian Empire, commanders, who lose thousands of soldiers in a single day, face immediate execution for incompetence. Morrison set down his fork. Our leaders were prepared to accept even higher casualties if necessary. They knew the cost would be enormous. They ordered the attack anyway. But why? Zethkar's voice carried genuine confusion. Surely there were other options, other strategies that would have cost fewer lives. Collins wiped his mouth with a napkin. There were. We could have waited another year to build more ships and planes. We could have tried a different landing site. We could have negotiated with the Germans. Then why did you not pursue those alternatives? Because every day we waited, more people died in concentration camps, Morrison replied quietly. Every month of delay meant more cities bombed, more civilians killed. Sometimes the fastest option is the only moral option, even if it costs more soldiers. Zethkar put down his eating utensil. You chose to sacrifice your own warriors to save enemy civilians. To save innocent people, Rodriguez corrected. There's a difference between enemy soldiers and enemy civilians. Children don't choose to be born in countries ruled by dictators. The alien commander struggled with this concept. In Valdorian warfare, civilian casualties are acceptable. They serve to demoralize enemy resistance and speed surrender. The three humans exchanged glances. Morrison's expression hardened slightly. That's one approach to warfare, certainly. Sensing disapproval, Zethkar attempted to regain his diplomatic footing. Of course, we prefer swift victories that minimize all casualties. For example, our conquest of the aquatic world of Tethys required only 3 days of orbital bombardment. The ocean cities surrendered once they realized resistance was futile. Ocean cities? Collins asked with interest. Zethkar's confidence returned as he described a more conventional victory. Yes, the Tethesians built floating metropolises across their world's vast seas. Magnificent structures, really. Some housed millions of inhabitants. How did you attack floating cities? Rodriguez inquired. Plasma bombardment from orbit, Zethkar explained. We destroyed approximately 30% of their population centers on the first day. The remainder surrendered unconditionally rather than face complete annihilation. Morrison nodded slowly. Quick and efficient. Exactly. Zethkar felt pleased that the humans finally understood proper military strategy. Why waste time with prolonged ground campaigns when superior technology can achieve victory in days rather than years? Your approach does sound more practical, Collins said carefully. Encouraged, Zethkar continued. The beauty of orbital supremacy is that ground forces become irrelevant. No need for soldiers to die in close combat when energy weapons can eliminate targets from space. That reminds me of something, Morrison said thoughtfully. Pete, didn't you study the Pacific Theater campaigns? Collins nodded. I wrote my academy thesis on island warfare in World War II. Zethkar frowned. Island warfare? You mean small land masses surrounded by water? Exactly like your floating cities in a way, Rodriguez observed, except our enemies were dug into islands instead of artificial platforms. Tell me about this island warfare, Zethkar said, curious despite himself. Collins pushed back from the table. The Japanese Empire controlled thousands of islands across the Pacific Ocean. Each one was like a fortress. Rocky atolls, volcanic peaks, jungle-covered mountains, all heavily defended. Did you bombard them from, what did you call it? Orbit? Zethkar asked. Morrison smiled grimly. We didn't have orbital capability. We used naval bombardment from battleships and bombing runs from aircraft carriers. For how long? Days. Sometimes weeks, Collins replied. We would pound an island with everything we had. Thousands of tons of explosives, artillery shells the size of tree trunks, bombs that could flatten city blocks. Zethkar leaned forward. And then the defender surrendered? No, Rodriguez said simply. Then we sent in the Marines. I do not understand. Why send ground forces if you had already destroyed the defenses? Collins stood and walked to a large display screen on the dining hall wall. He activated it and called up a tactical map. This is Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of volcanic rock, about 22,000 Japanese defenders. The map showed a small, roughly triangular island. Zethkar studied it carefully. Such a tiny place. Surely your bombardment eliminated most resistance. We dropped over 6,800 tons of bombs on this island. Collins continued. Our battleships fired more than 20,000 artillery shells. For 3 straight days we pounded every square foot of rock. The island looked completely destroyed from the air, Morrison added. No trees left standing, no buildings intact, just smoking craters and rubble. Zethkar nodded approvingly. Proper application of firepower. I assume your ground forces occupied the island without significant resistance? 70,000 Marines landed on February 19, 1945, Collins said quietly. The battle lasted 36 days. 36 days? But you said the island was destroyed. Rodriguez joined Collins at the display screen. The Japanese had spent months digging tunnels and caves deep underground. Our bombardment barely touched them. They waited until our Marines were on the beaches, then opened fire from hidden positions. The screen changed to show cross-section, diagrams of the island's interior. Zethkar stared at the network of tunnels, bunkers, and underground chambers. They built a fortress beneath the surface. Miles of tunnels, Morrison confirmed. Some went down 5 levels. They had underground hospitals, ammunition storage, command centers, even underground factories producing weapons and supplies. Collins manipulated the display to show battle progression maps. Our Marines had to fight for every yard of ground, cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel, room by room underground. The Japanese defenders knew they were going to die, Rodriguez explained. Their military code forbade surrender. They chose to make every American pay the highest possible price for victory. Zethkar studied the tactical information. How many casualties did your forces suffer? 6,800 Americans killed, Morrison replied. 19,200 wounded, about 1/3 of the entire landing force. And the defenders? Nearly all 22,000 Japanese soldiers died, Collins said. Only 216 were captured, and most of those were unconscious from wounds. Zethkar fell silent, processing these numbers. Finally, he spoke again. Your Marines knew the island was heavily fortified. They knew the enemy would fight to the death. They attacked anyway? They had orders, Rodriguez said simply. Iwo Jima was needed as a base for bombers attacking Japan. Every day we delayed meant more American pilots crashed into the ocean without rescue. So your Marines died to save your pilots? Morrison nodded. And the pilots risked their lives to protect the Marines on other islands. Everyone understood their role in the larger strategy. Collins returned to the table. Want to hear about Okinawa? That island was even worse. Zethkar's voice was barely audible. Worse how? Bigger island. More defenders. And this time, civilians got caught in the fighting, Rodriguez explained. About 100,000 Japanese civilians lived on Okinawa. They had nowhere to go when the battle started. What happened to them? Morrison's expression grew somber. Many died in the crossfire. Others were killed by their own soldiers, who told them the Americans would torture them if captured. Some families committed suicide rather than surrender. But our medics treated wounded Japanese soldiers and civilians, Collins added, even while under fire, even when their own friends were dying. Your medical personnel treated enemy wounded? Zethkar asked in disbelief. Geneva Convention, Rodriguez explained. International law requiring humane treatment of prisoners and wounded, regardless of which side they fought for. Zethkar stared at the tactical display, still showing the underground fortress of Iwo Jima. Your species created laws limiting how you could fight wars? Laws we followed even when our enemies didn't, Morrison confirmed. American soldiers who violated those laws faced court-martial and punishment. You punished your own warriors for being too effective in combat? Collins shook his head. We punished them for being unnecessarily cruel. There's a difference between fighting to win and fighting to cause suffering. The dining hall fell quiet. Zethkar looked at each human, face searching for some sign that they were exaggerating or lying. He found only calm sincerity. The third day of negotiations began with Zethkar staring out the window of his quarters. He had not slept again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images of human soldiers fighting impossible battles. Marines climbing volcanic cliffs under fire, paratroopers jumping into darkness, men wading through surf toward machine guns. He arrived at the meeting room determined to regain control of the conversation. These humans had shaken his confidence with their strange war stories, but he was still a Valdorian commander. He still represented the most powerful military force in the galaxy. Captain Morrison, he began as soon as the humans entered, I have been thinking about your island campaigns. While I admit they show a certain persistence, they also demonstrate the inefficiency of human warfare. Morrison took his usual seat across from the alien commander. How so? Your Marines suffered enormous casualties taking small pieces of land. In Valdorian military doctrine, such losses would be unacceptable. We would have found another way. Rodriguez poured herself water from a pitcher on the table. What other way would you have found for Iwo Jima? Zethkar felt more confident now. Simple. We would have bypassed the island entirely, or used nuclear weapons to eliminate all resistance at once, or negotiated with the defenders to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Collins leaned back in his chair. Those are interesting options, Commander, but they weren't available to us in 1945. Then you should have waited until they were available, Zethkar replied firmly. Valdorian commanders do not waste soldiers in futile attacks. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. That's a reasonable position. In fact, we've applied similar thinking in more recent conflicts. Recent conflicts? Zethkar asked. Afghanistan, Rodriguez said simply. Iraq, Syria, Somalia. We've learned to be more selective about our military commitments. Zethkar leaned forward, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate Valdorian superiority. Tell me about these recent wars. Surely with advanced weapons and technology your casualties were much lower. Morrison stood and walked to the window. Afghanistan lasted 20 years. Iraq, about 8 years for the main conflict, though fighting continued much longer. Syria is still ongoing. 20 years? Zethkar's confidence wavered slightly. That seems lengthy for a technologically advanced military. Modern warfare is complicated, Collins explained. When your enemies don't wear uniforms and hide among civilians, conventional tactics become less effective. Rodriguez activated a wall display showing a map of Afghanistan. The Taliban controlled about 70% of the country when we arrived in 2001. They controlled about 70% when we left in 2021. Zethkar stared at the map. You fought for 20 years and achieved no territorial gains. We achieved our primary objective, Morrison said quietly. We eliminated the terrorist network that attacked our homeland. But stabilizing the region proved more difficult than expected. I do not understand. If you possessed superior technology, why did the conflict last so long? Collins manipulated the display to show terrain features. Look at this landscape, Commander. Mountains, caves, desert. Perfect territory for guerrilla warfare. The enemy could attack our convoys and then disappear into villages or mountain hideouts. Why not destroy the villages? Zethkar asked. Eliminate the hiding places? The three humans exchanged glances. Morrison turned from the window. Because innocent families lived in those villages. Children, elderly people, farmers who had nothing to do with the fighting. In Valdorian warfare, such distinctions are irrelevant, Zethkar stated. Civilian casualties are regrettable but acceptable if they achieve military objectives. Rodriguez's voice grew cold. That's not how we operate. But it would have ended the war quickly, Zethkar insisted. Destroy a few villages, terrify the population into refusing shelter to rebels. Simple and effective. Morrison returned to his seat. Commander, let me tell you about a soldier named Danny Wright. He served 4 tours in Afghanistan, 12 years of his life. 4 tours? You mean he went back voluntarily? After each deployment, he could have chosen a desk job, Collins explained. Could have stayed home safely with his family. Instead, he kept requesting combat assignments. Zethkar frowned. Why would any rational being choose to return to a war zone repeatedly? His squad, Rodriguez said simply. His brothers. He couldn't abandon them. Morrison leaned forward. During Danny's 3rd tour, his convoy was attacked by an improvised explosive device. 2 of his friends died instantly. 3 others were badly wounded. What did this Wright do? He pulled his wounded friends out of the burning vehicle. Collins continued. Under enemy fire. Then he stayed with them, providing medical aid and returning fire until rescue helicopters arrived. Rodriguez added to the story. The enemy fighters were hiding in a nearby village. Danny could see muzzle flashes from windows and rooftops. He had a radio. He could have called for artillery strikes to level the entire area. But he did not. Morrison shook his head. He saw children running between the buildings, families trying to escape the crossfire. He held his fire and fought only individual targets he could clearly identify as combatants. Zethkar's voice was barely audible. Even while his friends were dying, even then, Morrison confirmed, because that's who we are. That's what we've chosen to be. The alien commander sat in stunned silence. Collins continued the narrative. Danny received a medal for his actions that day. But he never talked about it, never bragged about his courage. When reporters asked him about it, he said he was just doing his job. His job was to risk his life for enemy civilians? Rodriguez nodded. His job was to be better than his enemies, to fight with honor even when they didn't. Morrison stood again and began pacing slowly around the room. Commander, you asked why our recent wars lasted so long. The answer is that we chose to fight them with one hand tied behind our backs, voluntarily limiting your military effectiveness? Zethkar's voice carried disbelief. Rules of engagement, Collins explained. Strict guidelines about when and how we could use force. Every soldier carried a pocket card listing what they could and couldn't do in various situations. Rodriguez brought up another display, this one showing a dense text document. These are the rules American soldiers followed in Iraq. 27 pages of restrictions on the use of force. Zethkar squinted at the display. You gave your warriors a manual telling them how not to fight? How to fight honorably, Morrison corrected. How to distinguish between enemies and innocents. How to minimize civilian casualties while still accomplishing the mission. But this must have cost you many soldiers' lives, Zethkar protested. Collins nodded grimly. It did. We lost over 7,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Thousands more were wounded. Many of those casualties occurred because our soldiers took extra risks to protect civilians. Then why maintain such restrictions? Morrison stopped pacing and looked directly at the alien commander. Because we fight for principles, not just territory. Because how you win matters as much as whether you win. Rodriguez switched the display to show photographs. These are some of the soldiers who died following those rules. Lisa Parker, killed while delivering medical supplies to an Iraqi village. Mike Torres, died protecting Afghan children from a suicide bomber. Sarah Kim, lost when she refused to fire into a crowd to reach her target. Zethkar studied the faces on the screen. Young humans, all of them. They looked proud in their formal military photographs. They knew these rules might get them killed? They helped write some of them, Collins said quietly. Professional soldiers understand the difference between necessary violence and unnecessary cruelty. I still do not comprehend, Zethkar admitted. Your military possessed the power to end these conflicts quickly through overwhelming force. You chose not to use that power. You accepted casualties and prolonged warfare to protect enemy civilians. Morrison returned to his seat. That's right. But why? Because someone has to be better, Rodriguez said simply. Someone has to show that intelligent beings can solve problems without becoming monsters. Zethkar fell silent, his mind reeling. Everything he had learned about human warfare contradicted basic Valdorian military philosophy. Their soldiers volunteered for dangerous missions. They followed rules that increased their own risk. They chose honor over efficiency. Commander, Morrison said gently, you mentioned that Valdorian forces have never faced enemies with equivalent technology. What would your soldiers do if they encountered an enemy they couldn't defeat through superior firepower alone? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Zethkar had no answer. Valdorian military training focused on leveraging technological advantages. Their warriors were conditioned to expect easy victories through overwhelming force. We would adapt our tactics, he said weakly. How, Collins pressed. What would motivate Valdorian soldiers to accept massive casualties for strategic objectives? What would make them fight on when victory seemed impossible? Zethkar opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He could not think of anything that would inspire such dedication in Valdorian warriors. They fought for conquest and glory, not abstract principles. Your soldiers fight for each other, he said slowly. Not for empire or personal advancement. On the fourth day, Zethkar did not go to the scheduled meeting. Instead, he sat alone in the observation deck, staring at the stars. His mind felt broken. Everything he had believed about warfare, about strength, about his own people, had been turned upside down. The Valdorian Empire had taught him that power came from superior technology and overwhelming force. Win quickly, win decisively, accept the surrender of lesser species. It was clean, it was efficient, it made sense. But these humans fought differently. They accepted impossible odds. They died for strangers. They followed rules that made victory harder. They chose honor over survival, and somehow they were still here, still free, still fighting. The door to the observation deck opened quietly. Captain Morrison entered alone and took a seat near Zethkar, but not too close. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the nebula swirl in its eternal dance. You did not come to our meeting today, Morrison said finally. I needed time to think, Zethkar replied without looking away from the stars. I understand. We've given you a lot to process. Zethkar turned to face the human captain. Why did you tell me these stories? Why reveal so much about human warfare? Morrison smiled slightly. Because you asked. Because understanding is the foundation of any real alliance. Alliance. Zethkar tested the word. Not conquest. Not surrender. Alliance. That's what we hoped for, yes. The alien commander looked back at the stars. I came here expecting your species to kneel before Valdorian might. I expected fear, tribute, submission. Instead, you told me stories of your wars. And what did you learn from those stories? Zethkar was quiet for a long moment. That my people know nothing about real warfare. Morrison raised an eyebrow. That seems harsh. You've conquered 17 star systems. Through technological superiority, Zethkar said bitterly. We attack only when victory is certain. We use overwhelming force against inferior opponents. We have never faced what your Marines faced on those islands. Different circumstances require different approaches. No? Zethkar shook his head. It is more than that. Your soldiers chose to fight in impossible situations. They volunteered for missions where death was almost certain. They followed rules that made their own survival less likely. Morrison leaned back in his chair. What troubles you about that? I do not understand what motivated them, Zethkar admitted. In Valdorian culture, warriors fight for glory and advancement. They follow orders because failure means execution. But your soldiers, they seem to fight for something else entirely. What do you think they fought for? Zethkar considered the question carefully. At first, I thought it was patriotism, love of country. But that does not explain why they protected enemy civilians, why they treated wounded enemies with kindness. Go on. Then I thought it might be fear of punishment, but you said many of them volunteered repeatedly. They chose to return to danger. Morrison waited patiently for Zethkar to continue. The only explanation that makes sense is that they fought for each other, for the soldiers beside them, for people they would never meet, but who depended on their success. And what does that tell you? Zethkar stood and walked to the large window. It tells me that human strength comes from something the Valdorian Empire has never possessed, which is choice. The word came out as barely a whisper. Your soldiers choose to fight, choose to accept danger, choose to protect others even at the cost of their own lives. Morrison joined him at the window. Choice is important, yes, but there's something else. Zethkar looked at the human captain. What? Purpose. Our soldiers fight for something bigger than themselves, something worth dying for. I do not understand the difference. Morrison pointed at the swirling nebula. See those stars being born? They form because gravity pulls gas and dust together despite the cold and emptiness of space. It would be easier, for that matter, to drift apart forever. But it chooses to come together and create something beautiful. Stars do not choose, Zethkar objected. They form according to natural laws. Maybe. Or maybe choice is a natural law we don't fully understand yet. Morrison turned to face the alien commander. Your empire conquers through fear and force. Our soldiers fight through love and duty. Which do you think is stronger? Zethkar had no answer. He thought about the Valdorian military. Warriors who followed orders without question. Soldiers who fought only when victory was assured. Commanders who demanded instant obedience through threats of death. Fear motivates quickly, he said slowly, but love motivates completely. Morrison nodded. A soldier who fights from fear will run when the situation becomes hopeless. A soldier who fights from love will stay until the end, even if staying means certain death. Especially then. Zethkar turned back to the window. On Iwo Jima, your Marines knew they were going to die. Many of them did die. But they kept fighting, anyway. They fought for the Marines beside them, for the airmen who needed that island as a base, for families back home who needed the war to end, for people they had never met, for people they would never meet, Morrison confirmed. Silence fell between them again. Zethkar watched the nebula and tried to imagine Valdorian soldiers making such sacrifices. He could not. Valdorian warriors fought for personal glory and advancement. Remove those incentives and they had no reason to accept death. Captain Morrison, he said finally, what is the longest war in human history? Morrison thought for a moment. That depends on how you count. Some conflicts span generations, others cycle through periods of war and peace. Tell me about the longest one. The 100 Years' War between England and France lasted from 1337 to 1453. But if you mean continuous fighting, World War II lasted 6 years globally. 6 years of global warfare, Zethkar repeated. How many humans died? Estimates range from 70 to 85 million people. Zethkar staggered backward. 85 million casualties? Military and civilian combined. It was comprehensive destruction. And your species survived this? Morrison's expression grew somber. We survived it. We learned from it. We built institutions to prevent it from happening again.
How do you prevent such wars? By talking to each other, by finding common ground, by remembering that most conflicts start from misunderstanding rather than genuine hatred. Zethkar looked at the human captain with new understanding. Is that
why you told me these war stories? To prevent misunderstanding? Partly, but also to help you understand what humans are capable of when pushed to our limits. You were warning me. Morrison shook his head. I was informing you. There's a difference. Zethkar walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. If the Valdorian Empire attacked Earth, your people would fight like they did on those islands. We would defend ourselves, yes. Even knowing you could not win against our technology? Morrison returned to his own chair. Commander, let me ask you something. If humans invaded the Valdorian homeworld tomorrow, how would your people respond? Zethkar considered the question. We would calculate the odds of successful resistance. If victory seemed impossible, we would negotiate terms of surrender to minimize casualties. Sensible. But humans would not surrender. Would they? Morrison smiled grimly. We might negotiate, we might look for diplomatic solutions. But if those failed, if our freedom and way of life were threatened? He trailed off, letting Zethkar draw his own conclusions. You would fight, Zethkar said quietly. We would fight. Until the last human died. If necessary. Zethkar felt that strange tightness in his chest again. Your entire species would choose death over subjugation. History suggests that's likely, yes. The alien commander sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. I came here believing the Valdorian Empire was dealing with a weak species that would quickly submit to our demands. And now? Now I realize we were contemplating war with a species that does not know how to quit. Morrison leaned forward. Commander, what if I told you there was another option? Something besides conquest or surrender? You mentioned alliance before. Not just alliance, partnership, mutual respect, learning from each other instead of fighting each other. Zethkar looked into Morrison's eyes. What could the mighty Valdorian Empire possibly learn from humans? How to fight for something worth dying for? The words hit Zethkar like a physical blow. He thought about Valdorian warriors who fought only for personal advancement, about military campaigns driven by greed rather than principle, about an empire built on fear rather than loyalty. And what could humans learn from us? Morrison smiled. How to win wars without having to die in them. Despite everything, Zethkar found himself laughing. It was a harsh, bitter sound, but genuine. You would teach us courage and we would teach you efficiency. Something like that. Zethkar stood and walked to the window one final time. The nebula seemed different now. Less like a beautiful decoration and more like a reminder of the creative forces that shape the universe. Destruction and creation locked in eternal balance. Captain Morrison, I have a confession to make. I'm listening. When I arrived at this station, I carried authorization to declare war on humanity if negotiations failed. Morrison's expression did not change. And now? Zethkar turned from the window and, for the first time in his adult life, performed an action no Valdorian warrior had ever attempted. He knelt on one knee before the human captain.